There's a stretch of water, barely wider than the distance you could walk in half an hour, through which 1/4 of everything humanity buys, sells, and consumes must pass. If that passage closed tomorrow, the world as we know it would begin unraveling within 72 hours. This isn't speculation about some distant catastrophe. This is about a geographic reality that connects the smartphone in your pocket to decisions being made right now in Beijing, Washington, Tokyo, and a dozen other capitals where the consequences of miscalculation could reshape human civilization. The Strait of Malacca, at its narrowest point just 1.5 miles wide, serves as the jugular vein of the global economy. To understand why this matters, we need to trace the origins of our contemporary vulnerability back to a philosophy that transformed manufacturing and in doing so made the entire world dependent on the predictable flow of ships through a handful of chokepoints that could close at any moment. In the 1970s, Toyota engineers developed a production system that would eventually become the template for how almost everything gets made. They called it just-in-time manufacturing, and the psychology behind it was elegant in its efficiency. Why stockpile parts when you could coordinate suppliers so precisely that components arrived exactly when needed? The factory became a kind of orchestra, each instrument entering at the perfect moment, nothing wasted, nothing idle. It was beautiful, it was profitable, and it created a hidden fragility that we're only now beginning to understand. This manufacturing philosophy spread like a contagion of rationality. From Detroit to Stuttgart, from Seoul to Shenzhen, corporations embraced the idea that inventory was waste and efficiency meant vulnerability. They built supply chains that stretched across oceans, assuming one thing that now seems almost quaint in its optimism: that the seas would always remain open, that ships would always pass through, that the global system of trade was as reliable as sunrise. The South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca became the physical manifestation of this assumption. More than $3 trillion in trade passes through these waters annually. 80% of China's oil imports squeeze through the Malacca Strait. Japan, an island nation with minimal domestic energy resources, relies on this passage for its survival as an industrial power. South Korea's petrochemical industry, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturers, the rice that feeds 2 billion people across Asia, all of it depends on ships moving freely through waters that are becoming increasingly contested. To grasp what this dependency means, consider how different this is from the economic geography of previous eras. In the 19th century, Britain controlled the seas, but trade routes were diverse and economies were less integrated. You could blockade one port and merchants would simply divert to another. The system had redundancy built in through sheer diversity of routes and relative self-sufficiency of regional economies. Today, we've engineered redundancy out of the system in the name of efficiency. We've created what complexity theorists call a tightly coupled system, where disruption in one node cascades rapidly through the entire network. History offers us uncomfortable parallels. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and within days, the global order that Britain had maintained for a century began its final collapse. The waterway carried 2/3 of Europe's oil at the time. Britain and France, in partnership with Israel, launched a military operation to retake the canal, but they had misread the new reality of power. The United States opposed the operation, the Soviet Union threatened intervention, and within weeks, Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. The crisis lasted only days, but it permanently altered the hierarchy of nations. What's instructive isn't just that a choke point could be closed, but that the closure revealed which powers were truly essential and which were living on borrowed prestige. The psychology of leaders facing such crises follows predictable patterns. During the 1973 oil embargo, Western governments discovered how quickly abundance could turn to scarcity, how populations accustomed to cheap energy would respond to rationing with anger that threatened political stability. Lines at gas stations became symbols of national humiliation. The embargo lasted only months, but it shattered assumptions about perpetual growth and revealed the extent to which modern industrial society was hostage to decisions made by distant powers controlling critical resources. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave voice to what Chinese strategists had been contemplating for years. He called it the Malacca dilemma, the recognition that China's rise as an economic superpower had created a profound vulnerability. The more successful China became, the more dependent it grew on energy and resources that had to pass through a strait that could be blocked by hostile powers. This wasn't paranoia. It was geographic fact, and it drove Chinese strategic thinking in ways that would reshape the entire region. Understanding what flows through these waters is only the beginning. To grasp what a blockade would mean, we must first understand the complex web of territorial claims, military capabilities, and strategic motivations that could ignite such a crisis, and why the threshold for conflict is lower than most assume. The South China Sea is claimed, in whole or in part, by 6 different governments. China asserts sovereignty over almost the entire sea based on what it calls the Nine-Dash Line, a boundary that appears on Chinese maps and derives from claims made by the Republic of China in 1947. When the Communists won the Civil War, they inherited these nationalist claims, and they've never relinquished them. The psychology at work here is the same force that makes territorial disputes so intractable everywhere. National identity becomes fused with physical geography. To concede a claim isn't just to lose land, it's to diminish the nation itself. Vietnam claims much of the same water based on its own historical narratives. The Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei each assert rights to portions of the sea under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which grants nations economic zones extending 200 miles from their coasts. Taiwan, in a twist that reveals the complexity of the situation, makes essentially the same claims as mainland China, even as it seeks to maintain separation from Beijing's control. Each nation has its own story about why these waters belong to them, stories rooted in ancient fishing grounds, colonial boundaries, or modern legal frameworks. None of these stories are compatible. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled on a case brought by the Philippines, concluding that China's claims had no legal basis under international law. China rejected the ruling entirely, calling it void and without binding force. This wasn't just diplomatic posturing. It reflected a fundamental difference in worldview. For China, international law was a system created by Western powers during an era of Chinese weakness and therefore lacked moral authority. For smaller nations in the region, that same international law was their only protection against being overwhelmed by a much larger neighbor. Neither side was wrong about what the law meant for their interests. They simply prioritized different sources of legitimacy. The human mind struggles with such irreconcilable differences. We want to believe that disputes can be resolved through reason and dialogue, that there's always a compromise position that rational actors can accept. But territorial claims rooted in national identity don't respond to cost-benefit analysis. When a government's legitimacy depends on defending sacred territory, when populations have been educated for generations to believe certain waters belong to them by right, the space for compromise narrows to almost nothing. This is the psychology that turned Kashmir into a perpetual flashpoint between India and Pakistan, that kept Alsace-Lorraine contested between France and Germany for centuries, that made the Falklands worth fighting over despite being remote islands with more penguins than people. While diplomats exchanged formal protests, China began altering physical reality. Between 2013 and 2016, Chinese vessels deposited millions of tons of sand and rock onto submerged reefs, creating artificial islands where none had existed before. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were military installations, unsinkable aircraft carriers equipped with radar systems, missile batteries, and airfields capable of hosting fighters and bombers. The construction occurred in disputed waters, a deliberate challenge to rival claimants and to the principle that territorial disputes should be resolved through negotiation rather than unilateral action. The United States responded with what it called freedom of navigation operations, sending warships to sail within 12 nautical miles of the artificial islands, asserting that international waters remained open to all. These operations occurred regularly, scripted encounters where American destroyers would sail predetermined routes while Chinese vessels shadowed them, and both sides issued statements about defending their rights. On the surface, these were peaceful demonstrations of legal principles. But each operation carried the risk of miscalculation, of an accident or a moment of aggression spiraling into something neither side wanted, but both felt compelled to respond to. China developed what analysts call the cabbage strategy, layers of vessels surrounding disputed features like leaves of a cabbage. First come fishing boats from the maritime militia, civilians who also serve state purposes. Then Coast Guard vessels, armed but not technically military. Finally, if needed, naval warships hovering in the background. The genius of the strategy is its ambiguity. At each stage, it's difficult for other nations to determine whether they're facing a civilian activity, law enforcement, or military aggression. This ambiguity complicates responses and allows China to advance claims without triggering the threshold that would bring American forces into direct conflict. Smaller nations in the region watched these developments with growing alarm. Vietnam purchased advanced submarines from Russia. Singapore, despite its small size, acquired some of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft available. The Philippines developed shore-based missile systems. Each nation was caught in the security dilemma that has driven arms races throughout history. When you see your neighbor acquiring weapons, you cannot know whether their intent is defensive or offensive. The only prudent response is to arm yourself, which then appears threatening to your neighbor, who arms further in response. The dynamic is self-reinforcing and rational at every step. Yet collectively, it increases the probability of the very conflict everyone fears. History has seen this pattern before. In the decades before World War I, European powers engaged in a naval arms race, particularly between Britain and Germany. The construction of dreadnought-class battleships became a measure of national prestige and power. Alliance systems formed and hardened. Military planners developed elaborate mobilization schedules that, once initiated, were difficult to stop. What's haunting about the July crisis of 1914 is how many leaders recognized they were stumbling toward catastrophe but felt unable to step back. Kaiser Wilhelm II famously scrawled on diplomatic cables that he hadn't wanted this, but the machinery of mobilization and alliance commitments had acquired its own momentum. The South China Sea isn't Europe in 1914, but it shares certain structural features. Multiple powers with incompatible claims, military buildups occurring simultaneously, alliance commitments that could draw distant powers into local conflicts, and perhaps most dangerously, domestic political pressures that make backing down look like weakness. In China, nationalism has become intertwined with the legitimacy of Communist Party rule. For the party, defending territorial claims isn't optional. It's existential. Similarly, for the Philippines or Vietnam, governments that appear to yield to Chinese pressure face domestic audiences quick to accuse them of betraying the nation. Economic coercion has become a tool of statecraft in the region, offering a preview of what might escalate into something more severe. In 2010, after a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed Senkaku Islands, China imposed a rare earth export embargo against Japan. Rare earth elements are critical for manufacturing electronics, and China dominated global supply. The embargo lasted only weeks before international pressure forced its reversal, but it demonstrated both China's willingness to weaponize economic dependencies and the effectiveness of such weapons in an integrated global economy. Australia experienced a more prolonged campaign of economic punishment beginning in 2020 after its government called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. China imposed tariffs and restrictions on Australian wine, barley, coal, and other exports. The measures cost Australian exporters billions, but they also revealed limits to economic coercion. Australia found alternative markets, and more importantly, the campaign pushed Australia closer to the United States and other regional partners, culminating in the AUKUS agreement to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. Economic pressure had produced the opposite of its intended effect, strengthening rather than weakening the target's resolve and alliances. These cases echo a more consequential historical parallel. In 1941, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed an oil embargo on Japan in response to Japanese expansion in China and Southeast Asia. Japanese leaders faced a choice: withdraw from China and lose face, or secure alternative oil supplies by force. They chose to attack Pearl Harbor and seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The embargo, intended to restrain Japanese aggression, instead pushed Japan toward a desperate gamble that its leaders knew was likely to fail but felt compelled to attempt. The psychology of encirclement, the belief that external powers were deliberately strangling Japan's aspirations, overrode calculations of military probability. Game theory offers frameworks for understanding such decisions. though the reality is always more complex than the models. The chicken game, where two cars race toward each other and the first to swerve loses face, captures the dynamics of territorial disputes where neither side can back down without appearing weak. The prisoner's dilemma, where individual rationality leads to collectively worse outcomes, explains arms races and the difficulty of cooperation even when both sides would benefit from it. But these models assume that actors are purely rational calculators of costs and benefits. Real decision-makers operate under uncertainty, with incomplete information, domestic political pressures, and psychological biases that distort perception. Robert Jervis, a scholar of international relations, documented how the security dilemma operates through misperception. Actions that one nation takes for purely defensive purposes appear threatening to others who cannot know the intent behind them. When China builds islands, it may genuinely believe it's defending its rightful territory. But the Philippines sees those same islands as offensive platforms threatening its claims. Both perceptions can be honest, yet they're fundamentally incompatible. And because you cannot know another nation's true intentions, you must prepare for the worst case, which makes the worst case more likely. With tensions established and military capabilities in place, we must now examine the mechanics of blockade itself not as abstract strategy, but as a cascade of specific actions with immediate measurable consequences that would ripple across every sector of the global economy within hours. A blockade of the South China Sea could take several forms, each with different implications for how quickly the crisis would unfold and how other nations might respond. The most kinetically intensive approach would be mine warfare in the Strait of Malacca. Naval mines are among the most cost-effective weapons ever devised. A single mine costs a few $1,000s to deploy, but millions to detect and clear. They can remain dormant on the seafloor, activated by acoustic signatures of passing ships or magnetic disturbances from metal hulls. 100 mines scattered across the shallow approaches to the Strait of Malacca could effectively close the passage to commercial shipping. Historical precedent demonstrates both the effectiveness and the challenges of mine warfare. In 1972, the United States mined North Vietnamese harbors, including Haiphong, essentially blockading the north and forcing Soviet supply ships to halt. The mines remained in place until after peace agreements, when arduous clearing operations began. During the First Gulf War in 1991, Iraq placed mines in the Persian Gulf, damaging several vessels and complicating coalition naval operations. What makes mines particularly insidious is the psychological effect. Even after clearance operations, ship captains never have absolute certainty that all mines have been found. Insurance companies respond to this uncertainty by raising premiums to levels that make commercial transit uneconomical, effectively extending the blockade even after the military threat has diminished. A surface blockade represents a more traditional but also more visible approach. Chinese submarines and surface vessels could establish patrol zones across the South China Sea, declaring exclusion zones that commercial shipping cannot enter. Anti-ship missiles based on the Chinese mainland and on the artificial islands have ranges exceeding several hundred miles, creating overlapping fields of fire that make naval transit extremely hazardous for any vessel without sophisticated defensive systems. The legal framework for such a blockade would likely invoke some claimed security emergency, perhaps a quarantine against suspected weapons shipments or a response to alleged provocations. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers a model. In 1962, President Kennedy imposed a naval quarantine around Cuba, a blockade in all but name, boarding ships bound for Cuban ports to search for Soviet missiles. The operation was calibrated to demonstrate resolve while leaving the Soviet Union room to back down, which, after tense negotiations, they did. The most insidious form of blockade might be what analysts call a soft blockade, achieved not through military force, but through insurance markets and cyber disruption. Lloyd's of London and other major insurance providers could declare the South China Sea a war risk zone, immediately spiking insurance premiums to levels that make commercial shipping unprofitable. This wouldn't require ships to be attacked. The mere credible threat of violence would suffice. Simultaneously, cyber attacks on the automatic identification system that ships use for navigation or on port logistics networks could create chaos without firing a shot. Ships unable to coordinate arrivals, ports unable to process cargo efficiently, all of it would contribute to a de facto closure of the shipping lanes. History provides a precedent for using insurance markets as instruments of policy. During the Napoleonic Wars, British insurance underwriters effectively enforced blockades by refusing to insure ships bound for French-controlled ports. The economic consequences were often more devastating than the naval actions themselves. In the modern era, when just-in-time supply chains depend on precise coordination and minimal delays, even a soft blockade could prove catastrophically disruptive. The first 24 hours after a blockade begins would witness financial markets processing the implications faster than military forces could respond. Oil futures would spike immediately. Historical comparisons suggest price increases similar to those seen during the first Gulf War in 1990 or the Libyan crisis of 2011, potentially doubling or tripling prices within hours. Equity markets would plunge, particularly stocks tied to shipping, Asian manufacturing, and commodity-dependent sectors. Currency markets would experience violent swings as traders fled Asian currencies and sought safety in the dollar and Swiss franc. Circuit breakers, the automatic trading halts designed to prevent panic, would likely activate multiple times as markets tried to find a new equilibrium. The psychology of financial markets during crises follows predictable patterns of herd behavior and liquidity collapse. When uncertainty is extreme, the safest move for any individual trader is to sell, but when everyone sells simultaneously, prices collapse faster than fundamental value would justify. This overshooting in both directions, the initial panic followed by eventual correction, creates opportunities for those with strong nerves and deep pockets, but it destroys wealth for everyone else. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how quickly liquidity can evaporate, how markets that function smoothly one day can freeze entirely the next when trust disappears. Within 2 to 7 days, the physical reality of supply chain disruption would become apparent. Container ships that would normally transit the Malacca Strait would face a decision: attempt the passage despite the risks, or reroute around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That alternative route adds 3,000 to 4,000 nautical miles and 7 to 10 days to the journey. Shipping costs would increase accordingly. More problematically, the sudden demand for alternative routes would overwhelm port capacity in both Asia and destination ports. Singapore and Hong Kong, already operating near capacity, would face severe congestion. Ships would anchor offshore for weeks waiting for berths. The entire rhythm of global shipping would be disrupted. Automobile manufacturers would be among the first to halt production. Modern vehicles contain dozens of semiconductor chips, many manufactured in Taiwan and South Korea. The chip shortage of 2021, caused by pandemic disruptions, forced automakers to idle factories and left dealer lots empty. A blockade of the South China Sea would produce a shortage 10 times more severe. Within weeks, assembly lines in Detroit, Stuttgart, and Tokyo would go silent. The economic cascade would continue as laid-off auto workers stopped spending, suppliers to the auto industry laid off their own workers, and regions dependent on automotive manufacturing faced depression conditions. Pharmaceutical supply chains would face immediate crisis. Approximately 80% of the active ingredients in drugs consumed in the United States pass through the South China Sea region at some point in their production. Antibiotics, insulin, chemotherapy drugs, all would face shortages. Hospitals would have to ration medications. Patients with chronic conditions would skip doses. Preventable deaths would mount. The COVID pandemic demonstrated how fragile pharmaceutical supply chains could be, but in that case, production continued even as distribution was disrupted. A blockade would threaten production itself. The psychological impact on consumers would amplify the material shortages. Recall the panic buying of toilet paper and hand sanitizer in March of 2020, when empty shelves triggered hoarding behavior that created actual shortages of products that had been abundant days before. Now apply that psychology to electronics, automotive parts, medications, and 100 other categories of goods. People who would normally buy a new phone every 2 years would rush to buy immediately, fearing they wouldn't have another chance. The mere expectation of shortage would create shortage, a self-fulfilling prophecy driven by rational individual decisions that produced collectively irrational outcomes. Between weeks 2 and 4, industrial shutdowns would propagate backward through supply chains. European and North American factories, having depleted their inventories of components from Asia, would begin furloughing workers. Energy crises would emerge in East Asia as nations dependent on imported oil and natural gas scrambled for alternative suppliers. Japan's electrical grid, heavily dependent on imported liquefied natural gas, would face brownouts and rationing. South Korea's massive petrochemical industry, which requires continuous operation, would face shutdowns that couldn't easily be reversed. Once you turn off a petrochemical plant, restarting it is a complex and dangerous process that can take months. Agricultural supply chains would experience disruptions that wouldn't become fully apparent until planting seasons were missed. Fertilizer production depends on natural gas as both feedstock and energy source. Shortages would force farmers worldwide to reduce applications, lowering yields in the next growing season. The effects would be delayed but severe, and they would hit hardest in regions already facing food insecurity. Employment shocks would follow the industrial shutdowns. Shipping companies would furlough crews. Manufacturing workers would lose jobs. Retail sectors would contract as consumer spending plummeted. Each wave of unemployment would reduce aggregate demand, pushing the global economy toward recession or worse. The psychological trauma of sudden economic dislocation, the collapse of assumptions about job security and future prosperity, would persist long after the immediate crisis resolved. Military responses would unfold on parallel timelines. The United States maintains carrier strike groups forward deployed in the Pacific, but concentrating forces sufficient to contest a Chinese blockade would require 7 to 14 days. Submarines would reposition more quickly, but their effectiveness would depend on rules of engagement that political leaders, not military commanders, would determine. Alliance commitments would activate. The ANZUS Treaty binding Australia, New Zealand, and the United States would come into play. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty would obligate American defense of Japanese interests. NATO might be consulted, though the alliance's focus on the North Atlantic and Europe would make its role uncertain. The escalation ladder, the sequence of moves from demonstration to violence to all-out war, would be climbed one rung at a time, each step intended to signal resolve without triggering escalation, yet each step making the next more likely. Demonstration flights by bombers, warning shots across the bow of blockade vessels, limited strikes on radar installations or missile batteries. Each would be calibrated to send messages, but messages in crisis are notoriously difficult to interpret correctly. What one side intends as a limited response, the other may perceive as preparation for larger attack, prompting preemptive strikes that confirm the first side's worst fears. Nuclear weapons would cast a shadow over every decision. China maintains a no-first-use doctrine, pledging never to use nuclear weapons unless attacked with them first, but in an existential crisis, doctrines can change. The United States extends nuclear deterrence to Japan and South Korea, promising that an attack on them would be treated as an attack on the United States itself. This extended deterrence prevented nuclear proliferation by these allies, but it also means that a conventional conflict could escalate to nuclear dimensions if either side believed it was losing and faced unacceptable outcomes. The Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995–96, when China conducted missile tests and military exercises to intimidate Taiwan during its first democratic elections, saw the United States deploy carrier battle groups, and China ultimately backed down. But that was 3 decades ago, when the military balance was far more favorable to the United States. The balance has since shifted, and what might have worked then might not work now. The human dimension of these decisions should never be forgotten. Political leaders would face domestic unrest as energy rationing and unemployment triggered protests. Corporate executives would make impossible choices between idling factories and risking bankruptcy. Individual sailors and soldiers would implement orders that could trigger wider war. History is rich with examples of how pressure distorts judgment. Robert McNamara, architect of American strategy in Vietnam, later reflected on how he had been certain of assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong, how groupthink and institutional momentum overrode warning signs that in retrospect were obvious. Henry Kissinger's doctrine of constructive ambiguity, deliberately keeping adversaries uncertain about American responses, worked when it preserved flexibility but risked miscalculation when adversaries guessed wrong. The immediate crisis phase reveals fractures in the global system. But to understand the true magnitude of collapse, we must project forward, examining how a prolonged blockade would fundamentally restructure the world economy, international alliances, and the very nature of globalization itself. Economic systems under sustained stress don't simply pause and resume. They transform. Manufacturing that had migrated to China over decades in pursuit of lower costs would begin a reverse migration, but not back to its origins. The calculus that made Chinese production attractive, cheap labor offset by shipping costs and complexity, would be overwhelmed by the new variable of geopolitical risk. Companies would reshore some production to their home countries, paying higher wages in exchange for security. They would nearshore to friendly neighbors, hence the boom in Mexican manufacturing serving the North American market. They would diversify to multiple countries, accepting higher complexity and lower efficiency in exchange for resilience. The China Plus One strategy that corporations had begun implementing, maintaining production in China while developing an alternative supplier in Vietnam or India, would evolve into China minus total. The assets that had been built in Chinese export zones, the ports and factories and supply networks, would lose much of their value. This destruction of capital, wealth that had seemed solid one day and became obsolete the next, would be counted in trillions of dollars. The parallel to the British textile industry's migration offers perspective. Lancashire mills dominated global production in the 19th century, then lost out to cheaper Indian labor, then saw production return to Britain when automation changed the economics again. Each transition destroyed the capital invested in the previous configuration. Financial system stress would manifest in sovereign debt crises and banking sector collapse. Nations whose economies depended heavily on trade revenues would find themselves unable to service their debts. Rating agencies would downgrade their bonds, raising borrowing costs precisely when revenues were falling, creating a doomed loop of declining creditworthiness and increasing desperation. Banks that had financed trade and shipping would face cascading defaults. The Chinese property market, already fragile due to excessive debt and speculative building, would implode as external demand disappeared and millions lost their jobs. The 2008 financial crisis offers a template, but that crisis, despite its global reach, was geographically concentrated in the United States and Europe. This crisis would center on Asia, home to more than half of humanity. Energy markets would undergo forced transformation. Sustained high oil prices would accelerate investment in renewable energy and nuclear power, technologies that had struggled to compete economically with cheap fossil fuels. Japan, which had largely abandoned nuclear power after Fukushima, would face a choice between energy poverty and policy reversal. South Korea would confront similar calculations, but the transition wouldn't be clean. In the short term, coal would experience a resurgence, particularly in India and Southeast Asia, where access to cheap coal would trump climate commitments. The United States would find its shale oil and gas production newly strategic, able to supply allies and leverage that supply for diplomatic advantage. Geopolitical realignment would accelerate trends already underway. The Quad, the strategic partnership between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, would likely formalize into something resembling a military alliance. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which had maintained a posture of neutrality and non-alignment, would fracture as member states chose sides. Nations closer to China geographically and economically would seek accommodation. Those more distant or more threatened would align with the United States and India. The Korean Peninsula would face its own reckoning, as South Korea balanced its economic ties to China against its security dependence on the United States. India would emerge as the primary beneficiary of the crisis, assuming regional leadership as manufacturing migrated from China and as Southeast Asian nations sought a counterweight to Chinese power. India's navy would expand into the Indian Ocean, establishing a presence that would rival China's in the same waters where Chinese energy supplies must transit. Historical parallels to the Congress of Vienna in 1815 or the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 suggest themselves. Both were moments when catastrophic conflict reshuffled the hierarchy of nations and established new institutional frameworks that would govern international relations for decades. The post-blockade world would require similar reconstruction of the rules and institutions that had governed the era of globalization. China's strategic choices under isolation would determine whether the crisis led to reform or further confrontation. Domestically, the Communist Party would face a legitimacy crisis. Its claim to rule rests substantially on delivering economic growth and rising living standards. Prolonged economic contraction, mass unemployment, and declining trade would threaten that compact. The party might respond with internal reform, loosening control in exchange for renewed growth, following a trajectory similar to Gorbachev's perestroika in the Soviet Union. Or it might respond with nationalist consolidation, tightening control and directing popular anger outward, following the North Korean model of juche, self-reliance enforced through isolation and repression. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's vast infrastructure investment program across Central Asia, Africa, and beyond, would take on new urgency as land routes became alternatives to contested sea lanes. But this would deepen Chinese dependency on Russia and Central Asian states, creating new vulnerabilities. Nuclear posture might shift as China reconsidered its no-first-use doctrine in light of conventional military setbacks. Every choice would create new risks and dependencies. For the United States, the crisis would test hegemony and credibility. Can the system that Washington built after World War II, based on freedom of navigation and open trade, be maintained when challenged by a peer competitor? The burden of maintaining that system would have to be shared more equitably with allies. Japan's constitution, which limits military forces to self-defense, would likely be amended to allow full remilitarization. European strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should be able to defend its interests without American support, would gain traction as the United States focused on the Pacific. Domestic politics in the United States would fracture along familiar lines. Isolationists would question why Americans should risk war for distant islands. Internationalists would argue that credibility was indivisible, that failure to defend allies in Asia would embolden adversaries everywhere. The debate would echo arguments from the 1940s about whether to engage with or withdraw from the world, arguments that were settled by Pearl Harbor but have never entirely disappeared from American political discourse. Historical echoes of British imperial overstretch from 1945 to 56, when Britain discovered it could no longer maintain its global position, or of American post-Vietnam retrenchment from 1973 to 80, when doubts about intervention ran deep, would inform the debate. The humanitarian catastrophe would unfold on multiple fronts simultaneously. Food security would collapse first in regions already vulnerable. ASEAN nations are major rice exporters, feeding not just East Asia, but Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Disrupted exports would trigger famine in import-dependent nations. Yemen, Somalia, Haiti, all would face starvation. The fertilizer shortages would reduce crop yields globally, creating a second wave of food crisis in the following growing season. Sri Lanka's agricultural collapse in 2022, caused by a ban on chemical fertilizers, offers a preview of what happens when farmers cannot access the inputs modern agriculture requires. Yields fell by half. Prices spiked. The government fell. Social unrest and migration would follow. Populations facing starvation and economic collapse would flee. Climate refugees and economic refugees would converge on borders, creating political crises in receiving nations. Europe's experience with Syrian refugees in 2015 demonstrated how even relatively small migration flows could destabilize politics and empower nationalist movements. A refugee crisis orders of magnitude larger would overwhelm any humanitarian response. Public health would deteriorate as pharmaceutical shortages mounted. Antibiotics would be rationed. Diabetics would ration insulin. Cancer patients would be unable to access chemotherapy. The deaths would mount, preventable deaths from treatable conditions, because the supply chains that delivered medications had been severed. Medical devices from ventilators to diagnostic equipment would become unavailable. The mental health crisis from economic dislocation would compound the physical health crisis. Historical parallels to World War II blockades are instructive. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed millions, not because food didn't exist, but because it couldn't reach those who needed it. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 45 starved a population that had been prosperous months before. The question of whether suffering is deliberate or collateral becomes meaningless to those experiencing it. Technological development would reverse. The semiconductor shortage would halt progress in artificial intelligence, delay deployment of fifth-generation wireless networks, and stall the transition to electric vehicles. The digital divide between developed and developing nations would widen as access to technology became even more unequal. Scientific research would slow as laboratories couldn't acquire equipment or materials. The cumulative effect would be a lost decade or more of human advancement, opportunities for cures and innovations that would simply never happen because the resources to pursue them were unavailable. Cultural and psychological transformation would be profound. The era of globalization, when borders seemed increasingly irrelevant and cosmopolitanism appeared ascendant, would end abruptly. Zero-sum thinking would return to international relations. Nations would view each other's gains as necessarily implying their own losses. The generation that experienced the economic collapse would carry psychological scars similar to those borne by the Great Depression cohort, a lifetime of caution about debt and risk, a permanent skepticism about promises of prosperity. Nationalism would triumph over cosmopolitanism as populations retreated to tribal identities in response to external threat. Trust in international institutions would erode. The World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, all would be perceived as irrelevant, unable to prevent or resolve the crisis. This erosion of institutional authority would make future cooperation more difficult, creating a vicious cycle where distrust prevented the collective action needed to address shared challenges. Having witnessed the catastrophic unraveling, we must finally ask, how does this end? What pathways exist from crisis to resolution, and what choices, made today before the blockade becomes reality, could prevent this scenario entirely? Crises terminate through diplomacy, military resolution, or exhaustion. Diplomatic resolution requires mediation frameworks that all parties accept as legitimate. The United Nations Security Council would likely be paralyzed, with China wielding veto power over any resolution it opposed. ASEAN-led dialogue might offer a neutral forum, though ASEAN's own divisions would complicate its role as mediator. Track 2 diplomacy, unofficial channels where former officials and academics explore options without committing their governments, might create space for ideas that official negotiations couldn't entertain. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers the template for successful crisis resolution. Back-channel communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev allowed both leaders to explore compromise without public commitments that would constrain flexibility. The eventual settlement, American withdrawal of missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba, allowed both sides to claim victory before their domestic audiences while avoiding war. Critical to success was mutual face-saving, ensuring that neither leader